Hi, everyone. In this video, I'm going to continue talking about Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. If you're watching this video now, it's presumably because you've already watched the previous one. So I recommend that you watch the other one if you haven't, because this one picks up right where the other one ended. So in the first video, we talked about why Nietzsche thinks Attic tragedy is important and how he brings a Schopenhauerian framework of the will in thinking about art and culture, and how he modifies it by splitting the will into these two tribes, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, that then get unified in tragic plays because of the drama on the stage and the chorus on the side. Now, what I want to do in this video is continue that narrative and talk about the subsequent death of tragedy and later its possible rebirth, because Nietzsche is not just interested in the birth of tragedy. He makes an argument according to which the element of the tragic got pushed underground because of certain developments in ancient Greek culture that turned Greek life more Apollonian than Dionysian. So if in tragedy we see a balance, over time we see that actually Apollo, with its values of reason and understanding and stability, starts dominating Dionysus with its values of de-individuation, cosmic unity, and the loss of sensibility. And so that domination manifests itself in a culture that is fundamentally Apollonian. And that Apollonian culture is going to continue from the time of the Greeks, when the tragic is driven underground, all the way to the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's a very long period during which Dionysus is basically in exile, for the most part, not entirely. So what killed tragedy, according to Nietzsche? The short answer is Socrates. The longer answer is Euripides and Socrates. So let me talk a little bit about the longer version of the answer, because I think it's important to think about those two characters. Now, who is Euripides? Euripides is one of the three main tragedians of the classical period, along with Aeschylus and Sophocles. Now, they had different styles of tragedy, in the same way that different writers have different styles and write different kinds of books. They staged their tragedies and wrote their tragedies according to different styles and with different concerns in mind. And Nietzsche himself has a very clear ranking of preference about these tragedians. His favorite one is Aeschylus. His second favorite one is Sophocles, and he despises Euripides. So Euripides then gets kind of classified as the ugly duckling of the tragic trio. And in fact, he's made responsible by Nietzsche for having initiated the death of tragedy. So he says this tragedian, Euripides, starts killing tragedy from within. Now, this has to do with Nietzsche's understanding of what Euripides is doing in his plays. And he names a lot of things that Euripides did that, on his view, on Nietzsche's views, end up excising any element of real tragedy from his plays. So basically, his point is that if you look at Euripidean plays, they're not tragic at all. They're only tragic in name. And there are a few Euripidean moves that Nietzsche points to explicitly to defend this claim. He says one innovation that Euripides introduced was the use of naturalistic language into the description of tragic scenes. And Nietzsche really dislikes this because he believes that that naturalistic language makes everything too understandable and therefore takes out that element of the ominous that ought to infuse any tragedy. So, for example, if you compare two descriptions of the same event in Aeschylus and Euripides, you get very, very different descriptions. So let's say that something terrifying happens. Euripides will say, using naturalistic language, something like, and then the hero's hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he got goosebumps all over the skin. Now, yeah, that does capture the sense of terror and fear, but Nietzsche says it's too naturalistic, it's too biological, it's too literal. I think that's the better way to put it. Whereas if you get a description from Aeschylus about something horrible happening, he won't say, like, oh, the hairs in the back of his neck stood up. He'll say something like, and then the skies bled red. So it creates a much more atmospheric sense of something that is beyond the human acting and embodying that terror. A second thing that you get with Euripides is a focus on the desires, motivations, and intentions of particular characters. This person wants to do something, so they do it. This person is mad, and so they murder somebody. There is too much focus on human interiority. And that means that all the behaviors that the actors perform on the stage are ultimately intelligible because you know there are reasons for doing them, whether you agree with them or not. But in an Aeschylus play, you get a very different kind of structure in which humans sometimes don't even know why they're doing the things that they're doing. Rather, they just get kind of caught up in a wave of revenge that is greater than them, that they cannot understand, and that drives them out of their own mind at times. And thus, they act without knowing why they act. And so that element of the unknown, according to Nietzsche, of the mysterious, of the dark, of the impenetrable, it's a very important element for adding to our sense of the tragic. And Euripides just gets rid of that by constantly focusing on like people's mental states. I'll mention two final elements, although Nietzsche talks about other ones. So for a full account, you have to read the book. There's no way around that. Nietzsche talks about the prologue. So Euripides starts introducing prologues into his plays. So before a play actually begins, there is a speech that explains everything that you need to know about the play. And Nietzsche says that just takes out all the element of suspense. And the prologue is very similar to what we now have with movies, which is a trailer. And you can already imagine how there are some trailers that kind of give too much away to the point that you're like, maybe I don't even need to watch the movie any longer. And for Nietzsche, that's what happens with the Euripidean prologue. It just tells you everything that you need to know because it privileges the understanding of the spectator above all else. And so it's lazy. It doesn't actually try to invent ways of sharing important information through the creation of mood, through a sense of the tragic. It just literally tells you what you need to know. Now, I mentioned that the people who kill tragedy are Euripides and Socrates. And the reason is because Nietzsche says Euripides is just the beginning. The real killer of tragedy, the one that really put a stake through the heart of tragedy, is Socrates. And in fact, Euripides is just kind of like a version of Socrates in the context of tragedy. But it's really Socrates with his philosophy that takes out the tragic, not just out of tragedy, but out of Greek culture entirely. And when you think about Socrates, what does he represent? What are the values that he embodies through his philosophy? Well, we know that he used to just go around arguing with people, constantly asking them to define their terms, like what is justice? What is beauty? What is the good? Just like what is virtue? Always wanting clear definitions. That's Socrates. And we know that he praises just the value of reason. And so the Socratic philosophy, if we now step back a little bit, is a philosophy that is rooted in rationality, in cognition, in argumentation, and in clear definitions. And Nietzsche says there is nothing more Apollonian than that. There is no sense of the Dionysian in Socrates. And so, because Socratic philosophy became so famous, and was later popularized by his disciples, we then have this historical unfolding of a Socratic culture. Basically, all culture becomes Socratic because we start extolling the values of Socratism, of this scientific, rational, Apollonian approach to human life. Now, one important thing that I absolutely have to mention here is that Nietzsche is very clear that even though Apollo, through Euripides and Socrates, starts defeating Dionysus culturally, it's not as if Dionysus completely disappears. Elements of the irrational continue to infuse Socratic culture. And you can see this infusion in two places. One, you can see it in the form of Platonic dialogues. So, of course, Plato, Socrates' pupil, started writing dialogues in which Socrates talks with other people. That's how we know about Socrates, because his student Plato wrote about him. But Nietzsche says, are the Platonic dialogues really 100% rational and Socratic and scientific? Isn't there an element of the artistic and the Dionysian in them still? And he says, yeah, there's an element there that's still lingering in the very form of the dialogue itself. Because a dialogue is kind of like a play. So it's kind of like an art form. So Plato, who really wanted to be a rationalistic philosopher, ends up using an artistic genre, the dialogue, to express his rationalism. That's kind of irrational. Another place where you see this Dionysian element kind of sneaking into the Socratic culture is in the very myth that is created about Socrates. Because there is a way to read the life of Socrates as a tragedy, in the same vein as, say, the life of Oedipus in Oedipus Rex. And we know that Socrates consulted at some point the oracle at Delphi, wanting to know his truth, the truth of his life or his destiny. And I forget the exact translation, but the oracle at Delphi basically says something like, no man will be smarter than you, Socrates. Socrates decides that he's so smart that he knows exactly what that means. So there's already an element of pride in Socrates thinking that he can crack the mystery of the oracle. And so he says to himself, look, obviously the oracle told me that I'm the smartest person in the planet, and therefore it's up to me to illuminate everybody else. And that's what I'm going to do through this Socratic method of question and answering, where I just like trap people into debates in the public square. Now, the reason that I emphasize pride is because the oracle just said, nobody's smarter than you, which could mean that everybody's equally smart. But Socrates thought that he was smarter than the oracle. And so what happened is that in trying to assert himself, he ends up bringing about his own destruction. Because since he thought he understood the oracle, he then embarks on this way of life that ultimately gets him executed. So it's a classic tragedy, right? Like a figure thinks that he knows better. He sets in motion a series of events that terminate in his de-individuation, in his death. And so then in a Socratic culture, people start saying things like, oh, Socrates was so wonderful because he even died for what he believed in. And Nietzsche says, okay, that's fine, but now we're in the presence of a myth. We're creating a myth out of the life of Socrates. And that myth is fundamentally tragic. And so the Dionysian element is still there in the figure of the dying Socrates, the person who is so rational that their rationality produces the ultimate irrationality, which is their own death. Now, the point here is that Nietzsche wants to emphasize that the tragic has been defeated, but it has not been completely destroyed. And in fact, it cannot be completely destroyed because one fundamental force of nature can dominate, but it can never eradicate another fundamental force of nature. And even in Greek mythology, we know that one god cannot really kill another god. That's also part of their destiny that they cannot avoid. And so Dionysus has been driven underground, and it's going to remain there for a very long time. And Nietzsche, writing now from the standpoint of the 19th century, looks around him and he says, I think the tragic is finally making a comeback. And it's making a comeback in two places. It's making a comeback in Wagnerian operas. So there is a very detailed discussion of, for example, Tristan and Isolde, and Wagner's particular way of using music to, again, produce that Dionysian element, where if you listen to his operas, you're in such an ecstatic state that you feel as if you're losing your boundaries, you're losing your sense of self. Clearly a Dionysian experience. And so it's coming back in music, but it's also coming back in philosophy. And he says there are two philosophers whose philosophy is fundamentally tragic. One of them, I mentioned already before in the first video, Arthur Schopenhauer. The second one is Immanuel Kant, the father of German idealism. What is it about them that is so tragic? It's not their lives. It's not how they lived and died, like in the case of Socrates. It's actually the content of their philosophy. Because both of them believe that humans can never escape the limits of their human position. So, for example, Schopenhauer believed that we are always trapped in a wheel of desire. Because of the will, which I talked about earlier, we desire things, and then the more you satisfy your desires, the more you fuel your desire. And so it's this very pessimistic outlook in which we are fated to always want things and never really be satisfied. So a fundamentally pessimistic, tragic understanding of human life. And for Schopenhauer, there's not really much of a way out of this. And whatever you can do to escape that wheel of desire is only going to be temporary. You're going to fall right back into it. Now, with Kant, the tragedy of human existence is a little bit different. It doesn't have to do with desire, but it does have to do with the limits of human reason. So, in his critique of pure reason, Kant very famously says, I want to figure out what reason can do, what it can give me. But that means that first I need to figure out its limits. What are its boundaries? So that I know what it can and what it cannot do. And he draws the conclusion that reason will never give me answers to some of the questions that I really want answers to. And Kant also says that in terms of experience, we will always experience the world as our mind understands it, but we will never perceive the world or understand it as it is independently of our mind. And so it means that we're fated to see the world only as it appears to us, but never as it really is in itself, which is why Kant refers to the thing in itself as an X. It's just this unknown about which we cannot really say much. And that means that there is a tragic spirit to his philosophy. And the tragedy is that even though we have this powerful mental apparatus, it cannot really give you a lot of the answers that we want, and it cannot pierce through into the thing in itself. And so both Schopenhauer and Kant give us tragic knowledge. That's a term that Nietzsche uses. They give us tragic knowledge because they give us knowledge that highlights the tragedy of our existence. So in the realm of philosophy, we have this kind of new tragic spirit. And in the realm of art, we see this new tragic music with Wagner. And so Nietzsche is positioning himself, and this is an important point on which to end, as somebody who is articulating the possible rebirth of tragedy in German culture. And moreover, the possible reinvigoration of German culture through the tragic, because Nietzsche also thought that German culture had been losing its power for some time, and that only an injection of a dose of tragedy could reawaken it, so that German culture could once again, produce works of great artistic and philosophical and existential value.